Picture this, if you will. It's the winter of 1820, the kind of Missouri winter that makes you question why humans ever thought moving this far west was a good idea. Snow 3 feet deep, wind that cuts through log walls like they're made of paper, and somewhere out there in that howling darkness, something is circling your home. 7-year-old Jedediah Hawkins pressed his small body against the rough-hewn cabin wall, feeling every splinter through his thin shirt. Outside, his father Thomas was bleeding. The boy could hear it. That wet, ragged breathing that meant something had gone very, very wrong. And then came the sounds that would echo in his nightmares for the rest of his life. The wolves had found them. Now, when we talk about wolves in 1820 Missouri, we're not discussing the sanitized, nature documentary version you might imagine. These were creatures pushed to desperation by the harshest winter anyone could remember. Hunger had made them bold, and boldness had made them dangerous. The sound of tearing flesh, of bones snapping like kindling, of his father's final prayer cut short. These carved themselves into young Jedediah's memory with the precision of a master sculptor. His Cherokee mother, Sarah Running Water, discovered him at dawn. Picture that scene. A 7-year-old boy, still clutching his father's empty rifle, a weapon nearly as tall as he was, standing guard over what remained of their life together. She spoke no words of comfort that morning, no gentle reassurances that everything would be all right. Instead, she offered him something far more valuable, ancient wisdom, wrapped in brutal honesty. "The world has teeth, my son," she told him, her voice carrying the weight of generations who had learned this lesson the hard way. "You must grow sharper ones." And grow them he did. The frontier, you see, was the ultimate teacher, harsh, unforgiving, but absolutely honest about what it demanded from those who dared to call it home. Every single day brought lessons that city folk would never comprehend. Sarah's morning prayers became Jedediah's first education in complexity, Christian hymns flowing seamlessly into Cherokee earth spirit ceremonies, creating a spiritual framework that acknowledged both heaven above and the very real dangers lurking in the forest. But it was Moses Whitefeather who truly shaped the boy into something extraordinary. This old Shawnee tracker had seen enough fatherless children to recognize the hollow look in Jedediah's eyes, and he took pity accordingly. Moses understood something that escaped most white settlers, 2027. That animals weren't just resources to be exploited, but souls requiring respect. More importantly, he possessed knowledge passed down through generations of warriors who had hunted bears with nothing but spears and courage. Think about that for a moment. Bears, with spears. These weren't desperate acts of bravado, they were calculated confrontations between apex predators, human and ursine, where victory belonged to whoever understood the dance of death most completely. By age 15, Jedediah had absorbed lessons that would have killed lesser students. He could track a wounded deer across solid stone, reading sign that existed more in intuition than physical evidence. He could coax fire from wet wood in a driving rainstorm, understanding that survival often hung on such seemingly impossible tasks. His marksmanship had reached the level where hitting playing cards at 50 paces became routine practice rather than impressive demonstration. But Moses taught him something infinitely more valuable than technical skills: the art of seeing without looking. This wasn't mystical nonsense, but practical psychology borrowed from warriors who understood that the mind's preparation often determined the body's performance. When facing something that could kill you with a single swipe, your mental state became your primary weapon. The fur trade boom of 1823 hit the frontier like economic lightning. Suddenly, every mountain stream represented potential fortune, every beaver pelt a ticket to prosperity. A single pristine pelt could fetch $40 in St. Louis, understand. That's more money than most men saw in an entire season of backbreaking labor. The mathematics were intoxicating, but the Rocky Mountains demanded payment in blood. 1 in 3 men never returned. Those aren't Explorer Society statistics, HEA. Those are graveyards full of dreamers who discovered that nature doesn't negotiate. Jedediah invested every cent he possessed in the finest rifle money could buy, a Hawken rifle crafted by Jake and Sam Hawken themselves. 54 caliber, 34-inch barrel, each component handcrafted by masters who understood that in the wilderness, your weapon wasn't just a tool, it was your lifeline. This rifle could drop an elk at 200 yards, but Jedediah practiced at 20 paces, over and over, visualizing enormous shapes charging through his sight picture, because he knew what was coming. His first grizzly encounter arrived during the autumn of 1825, and it nearly ended everything before his legend could begin. The bear erupted from berry bushes like 800 pounds of fury given form, moving faster than physics should allow. Jedediah's shot went wide, the kind of mistake that usually meant death on the frontier. The bear's claws raked his shoulder down to bone before his partner's rifle drove it off, leaving him alive but deeply humbled. For weeks afterward, he studied his failure with the intensity of a scholar examining ancient texts. He consulted every native hunter willing to share knowledge, examined bear carcasses with surgical precision, and gradually understood the terrible mathematics of ursine anatomy. The heart lay protected behind layers of fat and muscle that could stop most bullets cold, but a precise shot behind. The shoulder blade could reach it, if you knew exactly where to aim, and if you could maintain that precision while 900 pounds of predator charged directly at your face. He began his legendary practice routine, DAT, meditation at dawn, breathing control learned from Blackfoot warriors, firing at pine cones, swinging in the wind until hitting them became as automatic as breathing, because he understood something that would soon make him famous throughout the Rocky Mountains. When you're 20 feet from forever, there's no room for almost. Captain Samuel Wilson's brigade of 1827 represented something we'd recognize today: calculated corporate ambition, dressed up as adventure. 24 men, each one convinced he was smart enough to beat odds that had already claimed hundreds of lives. They were venturing into Wind River territory despite explicit warnings from friendly Crow Scouts about something they called the demon bear, a creature that had been systematically killing trappers with what seemed like deliberate malice. But here's the thing about economic incentive. It has a way of making even rational men ignore inconvenient truths. Those untouched streams represented pelts enough to make every man in the brigade wealthy beyond frontier dreams. We're talking about life-changing money, the kind that could buy land, security, maybe even respectability back in civilization. Jedediah Hawkins joined Wilson's expedition for reasons that went beyond simple greed. At 26, he'd built a reputation as a marksman that stretched from Missouri to the Continental Divide. Mountain men spoke his name with the kind of respect usually reserved for legendary figures. But reputation, as any modern athlete will tell you, means absolutely nothing without results when the moment of truth arrives. The frontier valued performance over potential, and Hawkins understood that his defining moment was still waiting somewhere out there in the wilderness. March brought their first real introduction to what they were actually dealing with. Hawkins was checking trap lines along Willow Creek when he found the tracks, AAC, and understand, this man had been reading animal signs since childhood, studying under masters who could track a butterfly's shadow across granite. What he saw in that muddy creek bank stopped him cold. Front paws spanning 11 inches, claw marks extending 4 inches beyond the pad. Using the mathematical calculations that every experienced tracker carries in his head, Hawkins realized they were dealing with a grizzly that stood 10 feet tall and weighed over 1,000 pounds. Think about that for a moment. We're talking about an animal roughly the size of a small automobile, but infinitely more dangerous because it moved with predatory intelligence and supernatural speed. The brigade initially laughed off his measurements. Mountain men had a tendency toward exaggeration, and 1,000-pound bears sounded like campfire storytelling rather than biological reality. Their skepticism lasted exactly until they discovered Baptiste Dumont's camp. What remained of 3 experienced French trappers could have fit in a single burial sack. The bear hadn't killed for food. 2. It had killed for sport, leaving valuable pelts scattered like confetti across the campsite. This wasn't random animal aggression. This was something far more disturbing, calculated violence that suggested intelligence behind the savagery. Camp dynamics shifted overnight as fear took root in ways that modern people, protected by walls and laws and emergency services, can barely comprehend. Irish Tom O'Brien, a man who'd faced downriver pirates and survived 3 Blackfoot raids, began clutching Catholic rosaries and muttering prayers in languages his mother had taught him. Pennsylvania Jones increased his whiskey rations to levels that would have killed a lesser constitution. Even Captain Wilson, whose military bearing usually inspired confidence, started checking his rifle twice as often as necessary. Hawkins used this time productively, applying the analytical skills Moses Whitefeather had drilled into him years earlier. He began mapping attack patterns from every survivor account he could gather, treating the problem like a military campaign rather than a supernatural curse. Grizzlies, he learned, charged in perfectly straight lines, reaching speeds of 35 miles per hour across terrain that would challenge a horse. At that velocity, a man had approximately 2 seconds from detection to shot, 2 seconds to aim, fire, and hope his bullet found something vital enough to stop nearly half a ton of charging death. Most hunters, operating under adrenaline and terror, aimed for center mass, SAA, the largest target area, the most obvious choice. But with grizzlies, this represented a fatal error in tactical thinking. Their vital organs hid behind dense bone and muscle that could deflect even firm, heavy-caliber bullets. Hawkins practiced his behind-the-shoulder aim point with obsessive dedication, adjusting for angles, movement patterns, and the inevitable shake that comes when your life depends on a single shot. The bear announced its presence through absence, a phenomenon that every experienced woodsman recognizes, but few can adequately explain. Birds fell silent in expanding circles. Small game vanished as if the earth had swallowed them. Even insects seemed to hold their breath, creating an unnatural quiet that raised primitive alarms in anyone sensitive enough to notice. On April 3rd, it struck at dawn with the tactical precision of a military operation. Hawkins was checking trap lines when screams erupted from the main camp, not the shouts of startled men, but the primal terror of humans confronting something beyond their comprehension. He sprinted back through pine forest, crashing through undergrowth while his mind calculated distances and possibilities. The scene that greeted him defied logical explanation. The grizzly had materialized from morning mist like some ancient nightmare given flesh, grabbed Douglas Mackenzie in jaws, powerful enough to crush bone, and vanished before anyone could prime their rifles. 24 armed men, most of them veterans of frontier violence, had been rendered helpless by sheer speed and surprise. They found Mackenzie's body 40 yards into the forest, his spine snapped like kindling. The bear had carried a full-grown man with casual ease, killed him instantly, then disappeared without leaving tracks clear enough to follow. That night, while the brigade huddled around fires that seemed pathetically inadequate against the surrounding darkness, Hawkins shared his strategy. They would hunt in groups of 4, maintaining specific distances that allowed mutual support without creating easy multiple targets. They would practice synchronized loading drills until reloading became automatic muscle memory. Most importantly, they would prepare mentally for an encounter that would test every skill they'd ever learned about survival. Half the men wanted to flee immediately. Captain Wilson, calculating the enormous financial investment represented by their expedition, convinced them to stay just long enough to face what was coming. Because deep in the Wind River wilderness, something was hunting them with intelligence that bordered on supernatural, and it was only a matter of time before hunter and hunted met in final confrontation. The question wasn't whether the encounter would come, it was whether any of them would survive it. April 7th brought the blizzard that would frame legend. Snow fell thick as wool blankets, muffling every sound and limiting visibility to 20 yards, exactly the kind of conditions that turn experienced woodsmen into blind, stumbling prey. The brigade huddled in their main camp, fires struggling against wet wood that produced more smoke than heat, while the wilderness around them disappeared into swirling white chaos. Hawkins had volunteered for sentry duty, positioning himself upwind where his scent would carry away from camp, a precaution that reveals just how thoroughly he understood predator psychology. Years later, in letters that survived in various historical collections, he admitted to sensing the bear's presence before actually seeing it. This wasn't mystical nonsense, but the kind of primal awareness that kept our ancestors alive when everything in the world wanted to eat them. The grizzly emerged from that swirling white like a nightmare made flesh and blood. Snow couldn't mask the blood still staining its muzzle from what must have been a fresh elk kill, and its eyes held an intelligence that chilled deeper than any winter wind ever could. This wasn't some mindless beast operating on instinct. This was a predator that had learned human patterns, approaching from the exact blind spot between sentries that military tacticians would recognize as textbook infiltration technique. Hawkins watched it pause 30 yards away, that massive head swaying as it tested the air with senses far superior to anything humans possess. Think about this moment. A lone man with a single-shot rifle, facing a creature that had already killed multiple armed expeditions, in weather conditions that made accuracy nearly impossible. Everything he'd learned, everything Moses Whitefeather had taught him, everything his Cherokee mother had whispered about growing sharper teeth, it all came down to the next few seconds. At 25 yards, Hawkins shifted his weight with movements so subtle they might have been breathing. The bear's head snapped toward him instantly, those lips pulling back from yellow fangs the size of railroad spikes. Time stretched like molten glass, the way it does when your entire existence hangs on split-second decisions. The grizzly dropped to all fours, every muscle in that enormous body, bunching for the explosive charge that would close the distance in heartbeats. 22 yards. Hawkins thumbed back the hammer, feeling that well-oiled click through leather gloves as if it were transmitted directly to his soul. The bear exploded forward, 900 pounds of death accelerating through snow with the inevitability of an avalanche. This is where most men would have panicked, where training breaks down under the weight of pure terror. 20 yards, Hawkins fired. The .54 caliber ball flew true along a trajectory calculated through thousands of practice shots, punching through hide and muscle at precisely the angle Moses Whitefeather had drawn in dirt all those years ago. It shattered the shoulder blade, deflected through the chest cavity with ballistic precision, and tore through heart and lungs with devastating effect. The bear's roar cut short mid-bellow, but momentum carried that massive body forward even as life drained away through catastrophic internal damage. 18 feet, 15 feet, 10 feet. The grizzly's front legs buckled at 8 feet, its body ploughing a furrow through snow like some fallen giant before sliding to rest against Hawkins' boots. He stood frozen, rifle smoking in the bitter air, watching the light fade from those ancient eyes that had seen more violence than any living thing should witness. The silence that followed felt sacred, broken only by Pennsylvania Jones whooping loud enough to start an avalanche. Men poured from tents in various stages of dress and panic, some weeping with relief, others measuring the distance with shaking hands that couldn't quite believe what they were seeing. 20 feet from muzzle to initial impact, IMA, close enough to see death's approach in perfect detail, far enough for one perfectly placed shot to make the difference between legend and tragedy. They skinned the bear with ceremony befitting a fallen warrior, discovering 7 bullets lodged in its hide from previous encounters, testament to its seeming invincibility, until meeting Hawkins' calculated precision. Each bullet told a story of some other hunter's final moments, some other desperate shot that hadn't quite found its mark. The hide measured 11 feet from nose to tail, confirming every measurement Hawkins had calculated from those tracks weeks earlier. But more than size, more than the simple mathematics of death, this moment represented something larger about human potential when preparation meets opportunity under impossible circumstances. Hawkins had transformed himself from traumatized orphan into something approaching supernatural skill through disciplined practice and mental preparation that would impress modern sports psychologists. Word of the kill spread through the mountains faster than spring snowmelt, carried by trappers and traders who understood they'd witnessed something genuinely extraordinary. At the 1827 rendezvous on Bear Lake, I-5TA, think of it as the Resmele, annual convention for everyone crazy enough to make their living in the wilderness. Artists sketched dramatic recreations, while Hawkins demonstrated his technique to audiences that hung on every word. The economic impact proved immediate and substantial. Brigade leaders offered him double wages for future expeditions. Insurance companies, those early actuaries who understood risk better than anyone, reduced rates for any expedition that included Hawkins' trained marksman. But perhaps most tellingly, he chose instead to document his method in a slim volume titled Practical Meditations on Marksmanship, selling handwritten copies for $10 each to men who understood that knowledge like this was worth more than gold. Because what Hawkins had accomplished wasn't just exceptional shooting, disabling. It was the practical application of mental discipline under circumstances where failure meant immediate death, 20 feet from forever. With 2 seconds to live or die, he'd found that perfect intersection of preparation and execution that separates legends from footnotes in forgotten history books. The story of Jedediah Hawkins and his 20-foot shot spread through the American frontier like wildfire through dry timber, but here's what makes it fascinating from a historical perspective. Every telling changed the details, while somehow preserving the essential truth. Native tribes wove the encounter into oral traditions that would survive longer than any written account, though each version reflected the cultural lens through which it was viewed. The Crow named him Heart Seeker, believing he possessed supernatural medicine that allowed him to see through flesh and bone directly to an animal's vital organs. The Shoshone claimed the bear's spirit had entered Hawkins during that final moment, explaining his subsequent reclusiveness and apparent discomfort with fame. White settlers, predictably, preferred the David and Goliath interpretation, Omeifu. Frontier ministers used the tale to illustrate divine providence, protecting the righteous against overwhelming odds. Artists painted increasingly dramatic versions that bore little resemblance to witnessed reality. Some showed the bear standing fully upright like some Hollywood monster. Others added religious imagery that was completely absent from actual eyewitness accounts. But these embellishments reveal something important about how legends function in human culture. They become vessels for larger truths about courage, preparation, and the occasionally miraculous intersection of skill and circumstance. Hawkins himself grew increasingly uncomfortable with his growing fame, and his letters to his mother, preserved in the Missouri Historical Society archives, reveal a man genuinely struggling with the psychological aftermath of killing something he'd come to respect. In one particularly revealing passage, he wrote, "I have become celebrated for ending a life that had more nobility than most men I've known. The bear fought with honest intention. I wonder if I can say the same." This internal conflict would ultimately define the rest of his life more than any public accolades. The economic opportunities that followed his legendary shot were substantial and immediate. Fur companies competed to hire him as expedition leader, understanding that his presence virtually guaranteed both successful hunts and safe returns. Wealthy Eastern sportsmen offered enormous sums for guided hunting expeditions, treating him like some exotic celebrity whose skills could be purchased by the hour. But something had fundamentally changed in Hawkins during those 2 seconds at 20 feet. Perhaps it was the realization that he'd achieved everything the frontier could offer. The ultimate test had been passed. The highest stakes gamble had been won. Or perhaps, as his mother's Cherokee wisdom suggested, he'd grown teeth so sharp that using them no longer brought satisfaction. By 1830, his restlessness had become legendary among those who knew him well. He would disappear for months at a time, returning with stories of places no white man had seen, animals that existed only in native mythology, landscapes so remote that mapping them seemed pointless. His correspondence from this period reveals a man searching for something that success and fame couldn't provide, perhaps redemption, perhaps just peace. In 1832, Jedediah Hawkins vanished into the Canadian Rockies, leaving behind only a note that would become as famous as his legendary shot, "Gone to make peace with the bears." Some claimed he'd suffered a complete mental breakdown, unable to reconcile his role as protector with his reputation as killer. Others insisted he'd achieved some higher understanding of nature's balance that required solitary contemplation. His Hawken rifle, recovered from a remote cave in 1881 by a geological survey team, bore 27 carefully carved notches, and 26 animals and 1 legend. Modern ballistics experts who've examined both the weapon and the historical accounts confirm that his 20-foot shot required not just exceptional marksmanship, but superhuman emotional control under circumstances that would terrify trained soldiers. Contemporary sports psychologists study Hawkins' visualization techniques as early examples of mental preparation methods that wouldn't be formally understood until the 20th century. His practice of meditation, combined with repetitive physical training, anticipated modern theories about muscle memory and stress response management by more than a century. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Jedediah Hawkins story isn't the shot itself, but what it reveals about human potential when proper preparation meets absolute necessity. In an age before modern psychology, before scientific understanding of performance under pressure, a traumatized orphan had somehow developed methods for achieving peak performance that would impress today's Olympic coaches. The mathematics of that April morning in 1827 remain staggering. A single-shot rifle with no margin for error, a target moving at 35 miles per hour through blinding snow, 2 seconds from detection to impact, one opportunity to distinguish between life and death, legend and footnote. The statistical probability of success approaches 0, except that it happened, witnessed by 23 men whose accounts, despite minor variations, confirm the essential facts. The story endures because it captures something eternally true about the human condition, rife, that sometimes, when everything depends on a single moment, ordinary people discover extraordinary capabilities within themselves. Whether through divine intervention, perfect preparation, or simple luck, Jedediah Hawkins found himself at the exact intersection of skill and circumstance that transforms individual experience into collective mythology. In our modern world, insulated from the immediate life and death decisions that defined frontier existence, we struggle to comprehend the psychological pressure of those 2 seconds at 20 feet. But the story reminds us that human potential, properly focused and desperately motivated, occasionally achieves results that seem to transcend normal limitations. 20 feet from forever, when survival demanded becoming more than human, Jedediah Hawkins discovered that sometimes the impossible is simply the untested, and in doing so, he carved his name not just into frontier history, but into the permanent record of what humans can accomplish when everything they are meets everything they must become. The echo of that single shot continues to reverberate through time, reminding each generation that legends aren't born, they're forged in moments when ordinary people face extraordinary circumstances and somehow find the strength to become exactly what the moment demands.